The morning it happened was quiet in the way only farmland can be quiet. The wheat swayed in slow golden waves, brushing against each other with a soft whisper that carried across the fields. The sunrise washed everything in a warm glow, the kind my father used to say meant good luck for the day. I remember breathing in the scent of soil and fresh-cut hay, feeling the same grounded peace I'd felt my entire life on this land. This farm wasn't just dirt and fences. It was my family's story, written across 1,500 acres that my grandfather carved out from wilderness with his bare hands. That's why when my phone rang, I didn't think anything of it. Maybe one of the ranch hands checking in. Maybe the feed supplier confirming a shipment. Instead, I heard my lawyer's voice, tight, rushed, and wrong. "Frank," he said, not even pausing for a greeting. "We've got a problem. A serious one." I stepped onto the porch, staring over the fields as if looking at them long enough could steady me. "What kind of problem?" I asked. He exhaled shakily. "The HOA filed a transfer of ownership. According to county records, you sold them your entire property." I actually laughed. "Sam, come on, why would I sell my farm to an HOA?" But he didn't laugh back. "They have paperwork, Frank. Signed paperwork." The words hit harder than any punch. I felt something cold crawl up my spine. "Send it to me," I said. A minute later, my phone buzzed. When I opened the document, everything inside me froze. There it was, my name, my signature, my supposed consent to sell 1,500 acres of generational land to the Oakwood Hills Homeowners Association. Except the signature wasn't mine. It looked close, but too stiff, too forced, like someone tried to copy it from memory. My chest tightened. "This is forged," I whispered. Sam answered quietly. "I know, but it gets worse. The HOA already flipped the land to a developer. Construction plans are filed. They move fast unless we stop them." I drove straight to the county office, the gravel spitting behind my truck like the land itself was angry. Inside, the place smelled like dust and old paper. A clerk pushed a thick file across the counter. Every page felt like another nail in the coffin of everything my family built. Sale agreements, approval stamps, transfer confirmations, all tied back to one name: Marilyn Carson, HOA president. A woman with a reputation for acting like her suburban neighborhood was a kingdom, and she was the crown. She had forged her way into my legacy. My pulse hammered in my ears as I flipped through the papers. I should have felt defeated. Instead, a heat started building in my chest, something sharp and fierce. They thought they could erase me with a pen. They thought they could bury my history under asphalt and cul-de-sacs. When I returned home, anger pushed me straight to the old safe in my office. Inside were the documents my father left me: deeds, maps, tax records, proof of everything my family had earned. As I spread them out on the desk, one page slipped loose from an old folder. A tiny handwritten notation I'd never noticed before marked something unusual, a reference to land I didn't even realize existed. And in that moment, I felt the ground shift beneath this entire story. I realized part of their perfect neighborhood was actually built on my land. That thought hit me the moment I picked up the old inheritance folder again. This time, looking closer than I ever had before. My father never explained every detail in these papers. He probably assumed I'd read them thoroughly someday. But life on a farm teaches you to prioritize the living things first. The crops, the soil, the animals. Paperwork always felt like it could wait. Maybe that's why I never noticed the faint notation written in my grandfather's cramped handwriting. It referenced an additional parcel, recorded decades ago, tied to my father's inheritance. 300 acres, unused, unfarmed, barely documented. I frowned, pulling out old survey maps from the same folder, laying them across my desk until the edges overlapped like puzzle pieces. At first, it didn't make sense. The lines were faded, the boundaries uneven, but when I matched the old plats with the updated county grids, something clicked. The coordinates weren't pointing to unused pasture land. They weren't pointing to forest. They were pointing toward the edge of town, straight into Oakwood Hills. My breath caught in my throat. I pulled the map closer, tracing the boundary lines with my finger. The HOA's pristine, manicured streets, winding Cedar Drive, Carson Court, and Maple Ridge Lane, cut directly across the inherited parcel. Nearly a third of their entire neighborhood sat on land my family still legally owned. My heart began pounding, not with fear this time, but with something hotter, sharper. I shifted the map again, lining up the developer's expansion blueprints that had been included in the county file. And there it was, clear as the sun rising over my fields. Marilyn Carson's house, her pride, her throne, the home from which she ruled her HOA like a dictator, was planted squarely on my inherited acreage. For a long moment, I didn't move. I just stared at the sprawling subdivision built on what should have been my untouched land. The white fences, the decorative mailboxes, the identical lawns, all sitting on a foundation of theft, oversight, or maybe deliberate fraud. Unbelievable, I whispered, though the word didn't come close to capturing the shock rippling through me. Disbelief slowly gave way to something else, something I hadn't felt since this nightmare began. A sense of leverage so strong it steadied me. I wasn't the one trapped. They were, and they didn't even know it. I leaned back, feeling a slow grin pull at my mouth. If the HOA had simply harassed me, fined me, or tried to bully me, I might have fought fair. But forging my signature, selling my land, threatening to bulldoze my family's legacy? No, they'd crossed a line. And now, I finally understood just how badly they'd miscalculated. But revealing this discovery too soon would ruin everything. The moment Marilyn learned what I held in my hands, she'd scramble to cover every legal crack she could find. No, I needed silence. I needed patience. I needed them to believe they were winning. Revenge is loud when it lands. But the planning? That part has to be quiet. I gathered the papers into a neat pile, smoothing the edges with deliberate calm. Then I reached for my phone. My thumb hovered over my lawyer's name for one breath. 2 breaths before I finally pressed the call button. When Sam answered, I didn't waste a second. "We're not fighting them," I said, voice steady as steel. "We're taking everything back." I let them believe they had beaten me. That was the trap. A smart man once told me that the easiest way to catch a predator is to let it think you're prey. So that's exactly what I did. I showed up at the next HOA meeting in their pristine little clubhouse, the one decorated like a monument to suburban control. Every wall was covered with rules, schedules, and photos of Marilyn Carson handing out community awards like she was some kind of elected official instead of a neighborhood tyrant. When I walked through the door, the room went quiet. Heads turned. Whispers started. I kept my shoulders low, my eyes tired, my voice just a notch above defeated. It wasn't hard to sell. After all, they thought they had taken everything from me. That arrogance worked in my favor. Marilyn stood at the front of the room, hands clasped in the way she always did when she wanted to look important. When her eyes met mine, she smiled. Not kindly, but with the satisfaction of someone who believed she'd destroyed a man. "Well, Mr. Johnson," she said loudly enough for the entire room to hear, "have you finally accepted reality? The land deal is done. Your farm is no longer your concern." I swallowed the anger burning in my chest and forced my voice flat. "I'm just here to understand what happens next." The room murmured with condescension. Marilyn's grin widened. She believed she'd broken me. Let her believe it. A cornered animal is dangerous. A defeated one? Harmless. That's what I needed them to think. What they didn't see was the folded envelope inside my jacket pocket. Documents quietly filed with the county that reasserted my legal claim on the 300 acres beneath their homes. No one connected the dots. Not yet, and I wasn't going to help them. The meeting dragged on with Marilyn boasting about the upcoming development project, the increased property values, the progress Oakwood Hills would experience. Every lie she spoke only deepened the fire simmering under my calm exterior. but I stayed quiet. I nodded at all the right times. I even thanked her on the way out. Minutes later, I sat in my truck under the dim streetlights, opening a binder filled with everything I'd collected. Records of zoning irregularities, the forged signature they filed, timestamps that didn't line up, emails from homeowners complaining about harassment, even a few notes from residents who had started doubting the HOA long before this theft began. Piece by piece, their clean facade was cracking. Patience became my weapon. Every time they pushed, I pulled back. Every time they threatened, I stayed silent. Every time they sent a letter claiming I was trespassing on my own soil, I didn't react. Not yet. The more powerless I appeared, the more reckless they became, and reckless people always bury themselves. Within 2 weeks, the HOA sent me 7 violation notices. For dust, for noise, for unauthorized equipment within visual range of HOA boundaries. The louder their arrogance grew, the calmer I became. They mistook silence for surrender. That mistake would cost them everything. One afternoon, as I climbed out of the tractor, I saw it. A crisp envelope stuck under a rock on my porch. No return address, no courtesy, just a stamped header that made my jaw clench. Final notice of land acquisition. I held the letter in my hand, feeling the entire trap finally tightening around them. They thought this was their victory. They had no idea it was the beginning of their end. Their victory letter was actually the beginning of their collapse. I stood on my porch holding that envelope, feeling the crisp paper flex between my fingers. Final notice of land acquisition. They truly believed this was checkmate. They thought this letter would break me, force me to accept a future where my family's land was nothing more than an HOA expansion project. But what Marilyn and her board didn't know, what they never bothered to research, was that I wasn't the one trapped anymore. They were. The moment I stepped inside, I laid their letter on the table beside my maps and inheritance documents. The contrast was almost poetic, their fraudulent paperwork beside the land records that had survived 3 generations of my family. And right there, in the middle of the piles, was the real weapon. The deed showing my ownership of the additional 300 acres they so confidently built their homes on. I didn't waste time. By the next morning, I was at the county office filing an official ownership claim over the entire disputed section of Oakwood Hills. The clerk, an older man with half-moon glasses, skimmed the documents, then looked up at me with raised eyebrows. "This parcel overlaps with residential land," he said cautiously. I nodded. "I'm aware, it's mine." He didn't argue. The paperwork was airtight, cleaner and older than anything the HOA had filed. When he stamped the documents, the sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. That single thud triggered a process the HOA couldn't stop. The county's automatic freeze on all deeds tied to the disputed land. By noon, the first homeowner showed up at the county office, confused and angry, demanding to know why their home title had been flagged. By 3 p.m., mortgage lenders were emailing residents, warning them that refinancing applications were suspended until the property dispute was resolved. By 5 p.m., 2 real estate agents had canceled closings they'd scheduled for the week, and by the next morning, chaos had spread through Oakwood Hills like a brush fire. Home sales halted, mortgages froze, insurance companies flagged policies for review. The suburban dream Marilyn had built her identity around was cracking, inch by inch, under the weight of one undeniable truth. They had built an entire neighborhood on land that wasn't theirs. I arrived at the courthouse that afternoon because I knew that was where the panic would lead them. And I was right. Marilyn Carson was already there, pacing in the hallway, her heels clicking furiously against the tile. The confident queen of Oakwood Hills looked shaken, hair disheveled, hands trembling. When she saw me, her face twisted into something between fury and fear. "What did you do?" she snapped, marching toward me like she still believed she had authority. I let her get close enough to see the controlled calm in my eyes. "I filed what always belonged to me," I said. "The county is just doing its job." "You froze our deeds," she hissed. "People can't sell. They can't refinance. Banks are calling. You'll destroy us." I stepped forward, lowering my voice. Marilyn, I didn't destroy anything. I let the silence hang for a moment, watching her breath hitch. You already did. Her expression broke. Panic, realization, and a flicker of dread all fighting for space on her face. She stumbled back a step, as if the truth itself had weight, and for the first time since this began, the balance shifted. She finally understood she was no longer the one in control. The entire neighborhood erupted when they learned their homes might not legally be theirs. It started early the next morning, just as I was pouring my first cup of coffee. The phone buzzed with messages from people I barely knew. Neighbors, real estate agents, even someone from the county office. Every notification told the same story. Oakwood Hills was in full-blown panic. By mid-morning, cars were lined down the street in front of the HOA office. Residents pounded on the glass doors, waving mortgage papers and title documents, shouting accusations at anyone wearing a name badge. The air was thick with anger, confusion, and fear. These were people who had spent their life savings on homes they believed were protected by the very HOA that betrayed them. But the most remarkable part was how quickly their loyalty shifted. Just days earlier, many of these homeowners watched calmly as the HOA came after me. Now those same people were on the edge of collapse, screaming at the board for answers. How could you let this happen? Why didn't you check the land records? You said everything was legal. Agents began pulling out of home sales the moment the deed freezes hit the system. I heard one transaction was canceled right at the signing table. A young couple had been ready to close when the lender received the county alert. The bank refused to touch the deal. Overnight, the suburban pride of Oakwood Hills had become a financial minefield no one wanted to step into. Lenders issued warnings. Insurance companies threatened to suspend policies. Every hour brought another piece of bad news for the residents, and every piece of bad news pushed them further against the HOA board. I should have felt sympathy. I really should have. But most of them had been silent when Marilyn harassed me, fined me, and tried to erase my family's history. They stayed quiet because the injustice wasn't happening to them. Now that it was, their silence had turned into rage. And Marilyn? She reacted exactly how desperate people do, by lying. Flyers started appearing on mailboxes accusing me of orchestrating a land scam, claiming I was trying to steal homes from innocent families. Some neighbors avoided me entirely. Others glared when I drove past. A few even muttered things loud enough for me to hear. He's just bitter. He's trying to ruin us. He wants to cash in. They didn't know the truth yet. But lies are loud, especially when they come from people who built their reputations on false authority. Then the harassment escalated. One night, someone dumped trash across my gravel road. Another day, someone left a handwritten note on my gate saying I'd regret trying to take down the community. The childishness of it almost made me laugh, until the vandalism started. I rode out to check my cattle fence and found an entire 20-foot section ripped clean out of the ground. Posts snapped, wire mangled. Whoever did it didn't just want to intimidate me. They wanted to provoke me. But instead of anger, I felt something steadier settle inside me. Pressure only made me more focused. They were panicking, and panic always leads to mistakes. I just needed to keep letting them reveal who they really were. It wasn't until I walked the full length of the damaged fence that I saw it. A new sign hammered directly into my soil. Oakwood Hills, future development site. A fresh wooden stake. Fresh paint. Fresh arrogance. And at that moment, I knew this fight was about to turn into something much bigger. Their vandalism became the evidence that would bury them. The moment I saw that 20-foot section of my fence torn out, I didn't feel fear or confusion. I felt clarity. If the HOA wanted to escalate this into destruction, then every broken post and every snapped wire was going to serve a purpose. So before touching anything, I walked the entire stretch with my phone in hand, taking photos and videos from every angle. I recorded tire tracks in the dirt. I zoomed in on boot prints leading straight back toward Oakwood Hills. I even captured the fresh development sign they'd planted in my soil, the paint still glossy under the morning sun. I knew exactly what I was doing. They had handed me proof of malicious intent, and I wasn't about to waste it. The next stop was the county building. The same clerk who processed my land claim greeted me with a wary nod when I walked in. I spread the photos out on the counter, alongside the deed maps and inherited parcel outline. "There's more going on here than property confusion," I said. "Someone is trying to intimidate me off land that legally isn't theirs." He sighed, then pulled a thick binder from beneath the desk. "You're not wrong," he muttered, flipping through pages until he found a section marked in red. There were zoning warnings issued years ago for that neighborhood. The HOA board was told the northern development line might overlap unverified acreage. They chose to proceed anyway. I stared at the note, dated, signed, and never disclosed to homeowners. Marilyn had known there was a risk. She ignored it. And now the consequences were coming home. Word of the unfolding disaster must have spread fast because over the next few days residents from Oakwood Hills started reaching out to me quietly. Not publicly, not bravely, but cautiously, like people who knew they were dealing with a dangerous organization but had finally reached their limit. One woman handed me a folder filled with old violation notices Marilyn had issued without cause. Another slid me copies of emails where the board threatened fines for unapproved conversations between neighbors. Someone else brought photos of HOA board members trespassing on private yards late at night, measuring grass height like it was a criminal offense. Their perfect little community wasn't perfect at all. It was a machine built on intimidation and silence. And now that machine was breaking apart. But the biggest blow came from Sam, my lawyer. He said, "You're going to want to see this," and laid out a stack of financial documents tied to the developer who bought my land from the HOA. Missing signatures, skipped inspections, environmental surveys completed in just hours, something that should have taken days. They had pushed everything through illegally, banking on the belief that I would never challenge them. They never expected me to dig. And then came the final shovelful of dirt to cover their grave. My private investigators' recordings. Conversations between Marilyn and her board at the local country club, laughing about how they forged my signature, bragging about pushing an old farmer out, joking that I'd never figure out the paperwork. I listened to every word, not with anger, with certainty. Their downfall wasn't coming. It had already started. I returned to the county office the next morning. When the clerk saw the evidence, he didn't hesitate. He accessed the system, clicked through several screens, and issued a formal notice that would send shockwaves through Oakwood Hills. All deeds under investigation. And just like that, the ground beneath their entire neighborhood started to crumble. At the emergency HOA meeting, their empire exploded. I knew something big was brewing the moment I pulled into the Oakwood Hills Community Center parking lot. Cars were parked crooked, engines left running, doors slamming as residents rushed inside. The panic was so thick in the air it felt almost physical, as if fear had a weight of its own. When I stepped through the double doors, the room hit me like a wave. Every seat was filled, and dozens more people stood along the walls. The sound was deafening. Residents shouting at board members shouting back. Papers waved in the air like flags in a war zone. "What do you mean our titles are frozen? Why didn't you tell us about the zoning warnings? You said this land was verified." Marilyn Carson stood at the podium, her face flushed and blotchy, her composure unraveling by the second. She tapped the microphone desperately, but her voice was swallowed by the storm of angry homeowners. "Everyone, please, this is just a misunderstanding." A man in the back barked, "Misunderstanding? My bank just froze my mortgage." Another shouted, "You lied to us, Marilyn." I took a seat near the front, watching her struggle. Watching the Queen of Oakwood Hills finally lose her crown. It was a sight I wouldn't forget. When she finally spotted me, her eyes narrowed. She tried to regain some authority. "Mr. Johnson," she said sharply, "this isn't the time for your accusations. You've caused enough confusion." I stood slowly, the murmur of the crowd shifting like a tide. Confusion, I said, pulling a thick folder from under my arm. Let's clear that up. The room fell into a strained silence as I stepped toward the podium. Every step felt like a nail being hammered into the coffin of their little empire. When I opened the folder and spread the documents across the table, gasps rippled through the audience. Here is the original deed to my 1,500 acres, I began. Here is the inheritance record showing my additional 300 acres. Here are the zoning warnings the HOA ignored. And here, I held up the county's formal notice, is the investigation order freezing every deed tied to this land. Marilyn tried to speak, but her voice cracked. These documents, these don't prove. They prove everything, a voice interrupted. Heads turned as the developer's attorney stepped forward, holding his own stack of papers. Our company was sold land that was never legally available. Your board signed fraudulent statements, skipped inspections, and violated contract law. We are filing a lawsuit seeking damages exceeding $2 million. The room erupted all over again. This time with screams of disbelief, betrayal, fury. Several residents rushed toward the board table, waving their mortgage statements in Marilyn's face. Others demanded resignations, refunds, explanations, anything that might undo the chaos. But nothing could undo what they had done. One of the board members, James the treasurer, stood up shakily, tugging at his collar as sweat dripped down his face. Everyone, please. He looked at the papers in front of him, his voice hollow. We can't fight this. The legal fees, the frozen accounts, the lawsuits. His voice cracked. We're bankrupt. The room went dead silent. And in that silence, every ounce of the HOA's stolen power dissolved. The judge needed only 6 minutes to destroy the HOA completely. Courtrooms have a strange kind of quiet. Thick, heavy, suffocating. The kind that settles into your bones and doesn't leave until the gavel falls. As I stepped inside, every seat was taken. Homeowners sat shoulder to shoulder, clutching paperwork with white knuckles. Former HOA board members fidgeted in their suits, eyes darting nervously around the room. Even Marilyn Carson, always so sure of herself, looked like she'd aged 10 years in a single week. I took my seat beside Sam, my lawyer. He leaned over and whispered, "The judge has already reviewed the evidence. This won't take long." He wasn't wrong. The judge entered, adjusted her glasses, and opened a folder the size of a brick. She flipped through the documents quickly, her expression carved from stone. No impatience, no sympathy, just cold, precise authority. When she finally looked up, the entire room held its breath. This court has reviewed the filings, land records, inheritance documents, zoning warnings, private communications, and financial transactions pertaining to the disputed acreage. She paused. That silence was a knife. It is the ruling of this court that the Oakwood Hills Homeowners Association knowingly engaged in fraudulent property transfers, failed to disclose zoning violations to residents, and authorized the sale of land they did not legally own. A ripple of shock spread through the room. A few gasps. Someone in the back whispered a curse. Marilyn shifted in her seat, clutching her purse like it might anchor her to the sinking ship. But the judge wasn't finished. The attempted sale of Mr. Franklin Johnson's 1,500 acres is hereby nullified. Furthermore, the additional 300 acres inherited by Mr. Johnson remain his sole legal property. Any structures built on these acres, homes, streets, utilities, and community buildings, are under his ownership. The room detonated. Homeowners cried out, some in disbelief, some in fear. A woman burst into tears, dropping her mortgage folder to the floor. A man stood up and shouted, "What does that mean for us?" But the judge ignored him. Her job wasn't comfort. It was truth. Marilyn rose shakily to her feet. "Your Honor, this can't be correct. There must be a misunderstanding." The judge raised a hand, silencing her instantly. "Mrs. Carson, the evidence you and your board attempted to conceal speaks for itself. This is not a misunderstanding. It is fraud." The slap of that word echoed louder than the gavel ever could. Sam squeezed my shoulder, whispering, "This is it. You won." But I didn't smile. Not yet. Winning in court was one thing. Reclaiming my land was another. And the next step would be the one they never saw coming. The judge issued her final statement. If the residents wish to remain in their homes, they must negotiate directly with Mr. Johnson. Otherwise, they must vacate the premises. This court is adjourned. She struck the gavel once, sharp and final. As people filed out, some crying, some furious, some silent, Marilyn tried to approach me. But the sight of the legal documents in my hands made her stop mid-step. Her lips trembled, but she said nothing. There was nothing left for her to say. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, shoving microphones toward me. Homeowners shouted questions, demands, pleas. I didn't answer a single one. I walked past all of them, calm and steady. The same way my father used to walk rows of crops after a storm, measuring the damage, calculating what came next. And that night, under the same porch light that had witnessed every step of this fight, I sat at my old wooden table with a stack of envelopes. Eviction notices. One for every home standing on my land. By sunrise, every homeowner on my land had an eviction notice taped to their door. The wind carried them down the neat sidewalks of Oakwood Hills, white envelopes fluttering like warnings nailed to the gates of a fallen kingdom. I didn't need to be there to see the reactions. I could imagine it perfectly. A man in his bathrobe stumbling out to grab the morning paper, only to freeze when he saw the letter stuck to his door. A mother opening her front porch to find the notice crinkled beneath the welcome mat she had carefully chosen to match HOA-approved colors. Couples standing together in shock, reading the words over and over, hoping the meaning might somehow change. It didn't. The law was the law, and the land was mine. By mid-morning, my phone began ringing non-stop. Most calls I ignored, but when Marilyn Carson's name flashed across the screen, I answered. Not out of courtesy, but out of curiosity. Her voice trembled before she even spoke. "Frank, please, we need to talk." I kept my tone steady. "There's nothing to discuss." "You're destroying families," she said, desperation leaking through her words. "Children live in these homes. People put their life savings into them. You should have thought about that," I replied, "before you stole 1,500 acres and forged my name." She sucked in a sharp breath. For the first time, there was no arrogance in her voice, only fear. "If you let us stay, even temporarily, I'll step down. I'll take responsibility. Just don't do this." I closed my eyes briefly. A week ago, she stood in a courthouse calling me confused and unreasonable. Now she wanted mercy, but mercy wasn't hers to request. "It's too late, Marilyn," I said quietly. "You built your homes on someone else's land. You ordered bulldozers on my soil. You made this decision, not me." She broke then. I heard it in her silence. Throughout the day, homeowners flooded my driveway, forming a line of cars that stretched down the road. They knocked on my door. They begged, pleaded, cried, offered whatever they could. One man offered triple market value just for the dirt under his home. A retired couple said they would sell their RV and savings if I gave them more time. Someone even dropped off a basket of banana bread and a note apologizing on behalf of the neighborhood. But the truth was simple. I didn't need their apologies, and I didn't need their offers. I needed my land back. So I sold the ground beneath their homes, not to them, but to investors, developers, and anyone willing to pay top dollar for high-value acreage in a prime location. One by one, as the land changed ownership, mortgages collapsed, property values tanked, foreclosures spread like wildfire. By the end of the week, Oakwood Hills was trending on national news. Entire neighborhood built on stolen land. HOA fraud leads to mass evictions. Homeowners lose everything after illegal land grab. Reporters reached out, wanting interviews. I declined everyone. I didn't need a spotlight. I needed closure. And closure came in the form of a moving truck pulling up to a familiar house. The one with the largest porch, the fanciest shutters, and the perfectly trimmed hedges. Marilyn Carson's home. I watched from a distance as she carried boxes to her car, her shoulders slumped, her steps slow. Her empire had fallen, and with it her pride. When she finally drove away, the tailpipe coughing smoke. Everything she once controlled reduced to ruin behind her. I knew the chapter had closed. The Queen of Oakwood Hills had lost her crown. And her home. Bulldozers rolled in and erased their entire neighborhood. They arrived early, long before most folks had finished their first cup of coffee. The machines lined the street like steel giants, their engines rumbling low, sending vibrations through the soil. For years, those streets had been carefully manicured, inspected, patrolled by HOA volunteers with clipboards. Now they were marked with orange demolition flags and spray-painted lines. The perfect suburban dream was about to be torn apart piece by piece. I stood a few yards away as the first bulldozer lurched forward. The metal blade rose, glinting in the sun, then slammed into the front of a beige, cookie-cutter home. The sound, splintering wood, cracking beams, shattering glass, was deafening. Walls folded inward. The porch collapsed like a house of cards. In seconds, the place where countless HOA meetings had been held became a pile of rubble. And strangely, I didn't feel joy, not revenge. What I felt was something purer. Release. For the first time in months, the weight that had pressed into my chest began to lift. One after another, houses fell, perfectly identical mailboxes crushed, HOA-approved shutters torn from the frames. Each demolition struck me as a symbolic reversal of the years of harassment, arrogance, and entitlement the HOA had inflicted, not just on me, but on every homeowner they controlled. A small group of former residents stood at the edge of the property line, watching silently. They couldn't come any closer. The land wasn't theirs anymore. Some folded their arms. Others wiped tears from their cheeks. A few simply watched, unable to turn away from the destruction of what once felt like stability. Some glared at me, but most didn't. They understood now. Maybe too late, but they understood. Their trust had been misplaced from the start. The developers I partnered with handled the operation professionally. No shortcuts this time, no forged documents, no illegal approvals. They planned to repurpose the reclaimed land into a mixture of agricultural use, open pasture, and commercial structures that actually complied with zoning regulations. What used to be cul-de-sacs would become orchards. What used to be the HOA clubhouse would become a produce warehouse. What used to be backyards would eventually hold crop rows or grazing cattle. It felt right. For the first time, Oakwood Hills wasn't choking the land, it was giving it back. Every crash of debris, every cloud of dust swirling upward, felt like a chapter closing, a long, bitter chapter that had tested everything inside me. But seeing the land return to what it was meant to be felt like healing. It reminded me of my father's voice, steady and certain. The land will always tell you what it wants to be. Far in the distance, I noticed news vans arriving. Cameras were lifted onto shoulders. Microphones pointed toward me. A crowd of reporters marched across the dirt like they were preparing for battle. The first one didn't even introduce himself. He shoved a microphone toward me and demanded, "Mr. Johnson, how does it feel knowing you're responsible for hundreds of people losing their homes? Do you think this was ethical? Justified?" Another chimed in. "Some say you acted out of spite. Care to comment?" Their voices pushed in from all sides. Accusations, loaded questions, attempts to twist the story into something it wasn't. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I said a word, a voice called out from behind them. "Leave him alone. He didn't steal anything. The HOA did." A second voice joined in, then a third. Soon a small group of townspeople stood behind me. Not residents of Oakwood Hills, but people who had watched the corruption unfold and knew the truth. The reporters weren't expecting that. And in that moment, the narrative shifted. For the first time in years, my land felt mine again. After the dust settled, after the bulldozers left, after the reporters moved on, after the last fragments of Oakwood Hills were hauled away, I finally walked the length of the property without feeling the weight of someone trying to take it from me. The quiet wasn't the tense, waiting kind I'd lived through for months. This was the old quiet, the one I grew up with, the one that wrapped around the fields like a familiar blanket. I stepped into the open pasture where the neighborhood once stood. No more uniform lawns, no more mailbox rows, no more HOA patrols cruising by like they owned the place. Now it was just open land again, bare earth, turning soft under early morning dew. The air smelled of soil and the faint sweetness of nearby wheat. A breeze whispered through the remaining trees, carrying the same tune I remembered from childhood. I let my hand drag across the rough bark of a surviving oak. My grandfather planted trees like this to mark boundaries long before anyone thought of building a neighborhood here. I used to follow him around as a kid, listening to him talk about the land like it was a living thing with a memory of its own. And now, standing here again, it felt like the land remembered me too. The county had approved my proposal for a farmer's market on the southern stretch of the acreage, an idea that had been sitting in my father's notes for decades but never had the chance to grow. Local vendors would bring produce, crafts, and homemade goods. Kids would run through stalls. Families would wander from table to table. It would be honest, useful, part of the community in a way Oakwood Hills never was. I could almost picture my father standing beside me, nodding his quiet approval. He wasn't a man of many words, but he believed in leaving things better than you found them. As I walked the property, I felt his presence in every ridge of the land, every familiar scent, every memory stitched into the soil. For the first time since this war began, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel. Peace. Not the fragile peace that comes before another blow, but the strong, steady peace that grows when a storm finally ends. I had fought for this land, not just because it was property, but because it was the last piece of my family's legacy. Losing it would have meant losing them all over again. Reclaiming it meant I could finally breathe again. And yet, even as the weight lifted, something else settled in its place. A curiosity I couldn't ignore. The county clerk, the same one who had handled my land filings, stopped me outside his office earlier that week. He lowered his voice and said, "Frank, once things calm down, you might want to take a look at some of the older zoning approvals around here. Some signatures don't line up. Some expansions got rushed through in ways that don't make sense." I paused mid-step, hearing his words echo through my mind now. The HOA had been bold, reckless, and sloppy. But what if they hadn't acted alone? What if someone higher up had smoothed the way for their fraud? As the wind shifted across the fields, carrying the scent of fresh soil, I realized something unsettling. Oakwood Hills might have been only the surface. There was more buried beneath this land. More than houses, more than lies, more than even the HOA ever understood. And I intended to dig until I found it. I ended the HOA, but the fight for my land taught me something bigger. When the last remnants of Oakwood Hills were cleared away, it was impossible not to think about everything that had brought us here. An entire neighborhood, once full of spotless driveways and matching front doors, had collapsed under the weight of its own corruption. Not because I wanted destruction, but because the truth finally surfaced. And truth has a way of leveling anything built on lies. Walking through town in the weeks that followed, people spoke in hushed tones about what had happened. Some couldn't believe how far the HOA had gone. Others admitted they'd seen signs for years but never imagined the board would attempt something as bold as forging documents and stealing land. The headlines faded, the news vans moved on, but their downfall lingered in conversations at diners, hardware stores, and barber shops. Every board member faced consequences. Marilyn Carson, the self-appointed monarch of Oakwood Hills, lost her home, her savings, and her standing. Last I heard, she left town with whatever she could fit in her car, driving west without telling a soul. James Porter, the treasurer, filed for bankruptcy within a month. Others were sued by homeowners, blamed for negligence, or simply vanished when the legal bills started stacking up. Their little empire, once fueled by control and intimidation, was reduced to rubble faster than any bulldozer could manage. But despite everything they lost, I didn't walk away blind to the cost. People had suffered. Families were displaced. Investments vanished. And even though I knew none of this was my fault, I couldn't ignore that my decision to reclaim my land had reshaped an entire community. The difference, though, the line that mattered, was that I didn't start this fight. I finished it, and I did it because some things are worth defending no matter the price. This land wasn't just acreage or property value. It was the place where my grandfather taught my father how to hitch a plow. The place where my father taught me to mend fences and respect the soil. The place where every harvest felt like a testament to the people who came before me. Losing it would have meant losing the last living piece of them. So when people asked me if it was worth it, if the battles and courtrooms and confrontations were justified, I always gave the same answer. Protect what's yours, because no one else will. A man's legacy isn't measured in acres, but in how fiercely he guards what those acres represent. And if an HOA, or anyone else, thinks they can rewrite that story with forged signatures and legal shortcuts, they'll learn the hard way that land remembers its rightful owner. Standing on my porch at sunset, the fields stretching out in every direction, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Certainty. The light touched the soil with a warmth that reminded me of every generation before me. The land was quiet again, not because the fight was over, but because it was finally respected. But the clerk's warning still echoed in my mind. Those zoning irregularities, those signatures that didn't match, those unanswered questions buried deeper in the county filings. Oakwood Hills might have been the first battle, but I wasn't convinced it would be the last. And if anyone else tried to take what wasn't theirs, if someone else thought they could outmaneuver history or ownership or blood, I was ready. If anyone ever tries to take my land again, I already know exactly how to bury them.